Any questions about anything before we start? All good? Alright. So, we talked last time about the end of the Persian invasions, or the Persian Wars. And really, the end result being Athens and Sparta being the two main front runners, and how that radically changed how how should I put it? The balance in Greece was distributed, because before each polis kind of did its own thing, and sure, they were constantly fighting each other, but everybody just sort of was on their own. After this, though, there were two very clearly on top polis, and while Sparta was fine with going back to the way things were, Athens was very much shifting that status quo. And either you were with Athens or you went to Sparta for protection. You could not be your own little independent polis anymore, which was not how Greece had been, and not how the Greeks felt like they should be. But that was just the reality of the post-Persia situation was. So let's briefly talk about each of the major cities. Sparta, as I kind of alluded to before, were pretty late coming to Greece. They were Dorians. Initially were landlocked and began conquering the native populations to become soldiers and farmers. In the 8th century BCE, which is to say 900s, they conquered Messenia and enslaved pretty much the entire population. And this is where one of their big problems comes from, because they've got an entire region of their land is just slaves, the Helots. And this is when the Constitution of Lycurgus was initiated, which is to say, any freeborn Spartan male was made into military service, was put into military service in order to keep this massive slave population from overrunning the rest of Sparta. Now, that said, the Spartan military training was extremely brutal. I shouldn't say very few, but less than half made it out. So those that did were very, very good warriors, but there weren't very many of them. So you didn't have, as I said, you didn't have armies of like 10,000 Spartans going into battle. That 300 at Thermopylae was like a big contingent of Spartans. Technically, Sparta had a monarchical background. They had two kings of equal power, but they mostly were just representatives to the outside world. They mostly just went out and, they were basically like foreign delegates. The actual day-to-day stuff in Sparta was run by a council of elders who were all warriors. If I remember right, most of the time the kings were not from the warrior caste. So most of the Spartans within the city looked down on the kings, and they weren't especially well respected. Leonidas was very much an exception. So, the Peloponnesian League, which is a major part of this upcoming Peloponnesian War, was to maintain peace on the Peloponnesian landmass so that Sparta would not need to fight its neighbors while also dealing with the huge amount of slaves they had. So the whole point of the Peloponnesian League was so that they would have stable alliances with their next door neighbors and not have to worry about sending their army out while they're also trying to keep their slaves under control. So, as I've said several times, despite the fact that they had probably the best warriors one-to-one in Greece, if not that part of the world at the time, they did not have much manpower. The vast majority of the population were enslaved. The vast majority of the population was enslaved, and the Spartans that survived the training were few and far between. So, yeah, they weren't exactly a conquering nation. So there is, for some reason, this map's in French, but whatever, it's all the same. So you've got Sparta here, which again is landlocked. It's not down by the ocean. It's just up here next to the river. Where is... Yeah, Messenia's over here. So they conquered this whole region and just like made the people there into slaves. Corinth is literally between Sparta and Athens, like geographically located halfway between Sparta and Athens. Yeah, it controlled the isthmus that connected the Peloponnesian landmass to the rest of Greece. So, pretty important. It had these two huge double walls that could actually shut down land travel between Greece and the rest of Peloponnesus. Also, since it was on an isthmus, it had two big harbors, because an isthmus is, a strip of land, which means you've got water over here and water over here. And since it had access to both sides, both the Gulf of Corinth and, the rest of the Mediterranean, not the other side, it was able to trade all over the place. So in the many struggles between Athens and Sparta, it was, of course, a valuable ally. You really didn't want them... Well, you didn't want them on the other guy's side, regardless of who you were, but especially Sparta, because they would cut you off from the rest of Greece, just period, because Sparta didn't have much of a navy. It was mostly an oligarchy, which is to say ruled by a powerful few, which, back then was relatively stable. And for the most part, it remained, it was typically pretty neutral, but as we're going to see going forward, when Athens started getting aggressive, they joined up with Sparta. So you've got here Athens up here, and Sparta is down this way, because this is the Peloponnesian landmass, and then Corinth is right there on that isthmus. So Sparta here, Athens up here, and Corinth right in the middle. Also, just want to get this out there. For those of you that are going to do the default topic, talking about Athens and Sparta, two things. One, well, actually, yeah, we'll do this one first. Um, Athens was not the capital of Greece. There was no Greece back then. There was the Greek people and the Greek culture, but Greece as a single thing didn't exist. Um, this is this map is a modern day representation of Greece, but back then it was just all these little city states. So if I get because I get papers all the time where it's like Athens was the or Athens is the capital of Greece. It's like, okay, it is now, but back then there wasn't a capital of Greece because there wasn't a Greece. Um, Also, and this is just nitpicky, but it's a history paper, therefore write it in the past tense. Um, if you're writing, especially if you're writing about people, if you're writing about, for example, we're going to talk about this the next chapter. We're going to talk about Alexander the Great. If you want to talk about Alexander the Great, don't say he is something because he is currently a corpse. He was this guy that did all this stuff. Um, just for the sake of historical writing, that's how we it's always past tense. That's just for the sake of my brain. Okay, Thebes. So this was way further north. This was in Boeotia. They had lots of good agriculture, but unlike Athens, did not have a lot of mountainous area to protect it. They were out in the middle of these plains, so they were very open to attack. So rather than doing like Sparta and just conquering everybody and enslaving them, um, they created a loose federation of the various cities around them to just try and work together, and apparently it worked. And similar to Corinth, they had a fairly stable oligarchy to keep things running. So again, that was pretty normal back then. Just have a couple of guys running the show. So during the Battle of Plataea, which we talked about last time, it was that last big battle between Greece and Persia. Um, they supported Persia in the battle because, as I said, Persia had their Greek allies and Greece had the guys that were fighting against the Persians. Um, so Athens was very, very rough with the Thebans. Punished them materially and rhetorically, which is to say, um, cut off a lot of supply to them, a lot of trade to them, and rhetorically is to say, um, basically wrote a lot of hit pieces on them and tried to make it out that they were like these big traitors to the other Greeks, which, again, a lot of Greek city-states worked with the Persians because they didn't want to work with the Athenians and the Spartans. Although, as we're going to see here in a little bit, when Athens starts getting too big for its britches and starts taking over other cities, Thebes ends up joining up with Sparta due to Athens' imperial aims. This is a map that we'll kind of briefly talk about next chapter, but for a little bit, Thebes actually had a pretty big hold on a lot of Greece, real briefly. But for a little bit, they were like the big dog. I really hate that they use like two different shades of yellow. Like yellow and then sort of this mustard yellow. Like, why would you do that? Anyway, and then of course Athens, which is known for its democracy. Um, so geographically, it was ringed by mountains, which made it very easy to defend. It had a very fertile hinterland, um, so it was easy to grow wheat and olives. It also had access to the sea, so, well, they could trade very easily. They also had silver deposits in their hinterland, the known as Attica. So, like I've said since the start of this chapter, Athens was easy mode. Athens, that was, you play, a 4X Empire Builder game, and you choose baby diaper easy mode, and that's Athens. You get everything. You get the best possible defense, you get the best possible trade routes, you get all the resources. Yeah, they had everything. So, since they didn't have to struggle, they allowed all free males to become citizens. And when there was a struggle between two aristocratic families, you don't need to know all these names. Just, this is what led to the eventual democracy. Cleisthenes of the Achaemenids, I don't know, this guy, I do not have the brain power to attempt Greek right now. He suggested an assembly of the Demes, which is to say, the people. That's where we get democracy, the demos. So the small villages outside of Athens to basically have a vote to decide who would get to run Athens. So this gave people beyond the city itself a voice in how Athens would be run. Now, while this was technically a democracy, it was extremely qualified. You had to be free, because of course there was slavery in Athens. It's not like Athens was some shining beacon on a hill. You had to be male, because of course this was ancient Greece. You had to be landowning, so you couldn't just be, a sharecropper or a wandering laborer. But it was still a pretty major shift in how governance was done in this era of history. Now, to be fair, this was basically how American democracy was early on. You had to be male and free and own land in order to vote in like the 17, 1800s. You couldn't be someone who was landless. Obviously, women couldn't vote, and obviously slaves couldn't vote. But like even men who were poor were not allowed to vote, because the founding fathers like, oh, we don't want the unwashed masses to be voting. So yeah, just FYI. We'll get more into this in a little bit. So, again, the Greeks defeated Persia. They defeated the Persians in Greece and forced them back to Persia. So the Greeks continued to fight each other, which was pretty normal. So the big rhetoric behind Athens was that they wanted to unite Greece against Persia, but in a way that they would unite under Athens. It wouldn't just be, oh, well, we're all going to be a unified Greece. You're all going to unify under Athens. You're going to follow us. So they created the Delian League. There's a polis out in the middle of the Greek, not the Greek, the Aegean Sea, called Delos. So it was like this geographic center of all of this, and that was technically the center of the Alien League, um, and that was where this was supposed to be. But obviously, Athens was running it. Um, the Peloponnesian League, which is what Sparta had created, as we mentioned, um, pulled out of this coalition as soon as Persia was driven out of Greece, because the Peloponnesian League didn't want anything to do with future conflicts. They were trying to keep their slaves under control. So after the Persian Wars, Sparta suggested that they pull the Ionian Greeks back to mainland Greece so that they don't have to worry about dealing with the Persians anymore. Excuse me. But Athens decided to be more aggressive, and they managed to actually push Persia out of Ionia entirely. Ionia, again, being Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. So Athens was becoming more aggressive, taking more polis. Um, those in the league were pressured to adopt an Athenian-style democracy, which again was seen as being really aggressive. To demand that your allies have the same kind of government as you, that's not something you're supposed to do. You're supposed to let the other cities do their own thing. I mean, it's similar to, America spreading democracy at the point of a gun. Same idea here. Conquered Islands is the name of the Delian League. Naxos tried to withdraw. Athens attacked it because, of course, they did. They conquered the polis between it and Corinth, which meant that they now were right on Corinth's doorstep. Remember, Corinth is this in-between polis between Athens and Sparta, but now Athens is right on Corinth's doorstep. So this caused Corinth to join the Peloponnesian League so that Sparta would protect it. Because, it doesn't take much to see, hey, these guys are being really aggressive and taking land, and now they're like right outside our walls. I wonder what's going to happen next. Athens also pushed north into Boeotia. Sparta sent aid to help Thebes against Athens, and Thebes was like, well, this is obvious who's on our side, so they joined Sparta and the Peloponnesian League to hopefully keep Athens from taking them over as well. So there was a brief conflict between the Delian League and the Peloponnesian League. They signed a treaty. It was a treaty, but really it's more of a truce. It was basically, hey, we're going to not fight for 30 years, and then after that, we'll beat the hell out of each other. The next year, Athens moved the Delian treasury to its own city, and the Delian members had to pay Athens the normal Delian dues, which was just blatantly, this is an Athenian empire now. This isn't a Delian league. This isn't we're all coming together for mutual benefit. This is, Athens is in charge, and we're paying to not be destroyed. Don't know why I got so many emails. So here we have Sparta in the Peloponnesian League, they're in red. Um, and then blue is Athenian territory, while yellow is the league members conferring ships or funds. Because Argos still was on the side of Athens. They refused to join the Peloponnesian League. So yeah, the Peloponnesian League was really big. But also, the Delian League was really big. But the Peloponnesian League has Sparta. Well, actually, this should have been. This was. Thebes was on Sparta's side, so I don't know why that's yellow. Pericles. He was an Athenian politician. Um, pushed for Athenian prosperity, very imperialistic. Basically, he was all about, Athens going out and conquering everything. He was the one that moved the Delian treasury to Athens, and they opened it up to pay for civil construction projects, which you're not supposed to do. That would be like the United States moving the UN treasury to New York and then using it to pay for like the subway or something. You don't do that. But they did because they could. He had a strong anti-Sparta policy. There was this whole, I'm pretty sure that speech is at the end of this chapter because it's super famous. Yeah. The end of this chapter is this speech. Let's see. A funeral oration of Pericles, where he stood at a high platform at a great site and spoke like this, where he basically was telling the Athenians how they've lost these amount of men in this early in the war, and but how they were going to conquer the Spartans because of Athenian supremacy and blah blah. It's all very nationalistic. The funeral oration, the winter after the war broke out, and then the next year he died. Probably due to the disease spreading through Athens at the time. They had a bout of. I think we'll get to it. I think some of the theories are maybe like early bubonic plague. Like it was not great. So let's get into Peloponnesian War real quick. 431. Athenian strategy was to pull everyone from Attica into the Athenian city and let the Spartans raise the countryside, while the Athenian navy did the job. I compare this to back when my sister and I were young. I remember we were sitting out in front of Cracker Barrel and they had one of the little checker tables out front. And for some reason we decided to put the red pieces on the red squares and the black pieces on the black squares and try to play checkers like that. Obviously, it's not going to work because you're never going to interact. Your pieces are never going to touch each other. And obviously it was just dumb kids doing dumb stuff. But that's kind of how this war was, or at least this section of the war, because the Spartans were on land and the Athenians were at sea, and they never really were able to cross paths, except for the fact that the Athenians, the city was out on land, and the Spartans were besieging the city, so there was that, but they didn't have armies on land. Anyway, we'll see this again later with Rome and Carthage. There were some issues in the first phase of the war. This was known as the Archidamian War, after the Spartan king Archidamus. By 430, well, let's just put it this way. Athens was a pretty heavily populated city to begin with. And they brought in everybody from the countryside and crammed them behind these big, heavy walls. So now they're heavily crowded, they're stuffed in the city, and not a lot of sanitation happening, because this isn't like Rome where they had running water. So there was a huge outbreak of disease. As I said, this was maybe the bubonic plague, maybe typhus. Either way, it was something bad. It spread very quickly. It killed very quickly. It ruined Athens. Meanwhile, what was supposed to have been going on, where Athens' navy was just whipping Sparta's allies. Sparta's allies were actually doing pretty well out on the ocean, and this also meant that Athens' Delian allies couldn't get any supplies into Athens. So not only are they dying of disease, they're also starving. So by 421, there was a peace agreement. The Athenian Empire was essentially recognized. They were like, okay, well, you've got your own little empire. That's cool. The only thing Sparta really wanted was aid in keeping its slave population under control. They didn't really care about Athens doing what it was doing. So nothing was actually really done to protect the polis from being taken over by the Athenian Empire. So not a lot was really done with this. A lot of people died of disease, but this section of the Peloponnesian War really didn't do much. So yeah, here we have Athens and its allies, Sparta and its allies, which is weird seeing Athens in red and Sparta in blue, but whatever. And then neutral areas as well. And then, of course, Persia was still very much there. All right, this is the main part of the war. Nobody was especially happy with these negotiations. Argos and Corinth allied. Sparta had to whip them. Athens decided to take the war to Sicily under Alcibiades. However, how do I put this? Alcibiades was the stereotypical he was very Greek, which is to say, Greeks invented orgies and Romans invited women. That was Alcibiades. He was called back to Athens to stand trial for sacrilege and impiety. He got in trouble. Rather than going back to Athens to get in trouble, though, he fled to Sparta, and considering he was the guy that was in charge of the Sicilian invasion, told Sparta what was up, and this didn't go so well for Athens. Now, as I've mentioned, Sparta was mostly a land power, and Athens was mostly a sea power. So, as powerful as Sparta was, they couldn't match Athens at sea. All their power were dudes on land. So they looked to Persia to help them out at sea, and in 405 BCE, the Athenian navy was destroyed. So by 404 BCE, which, by the way, is an important date, that was when Athens sued for peace, and the Peloponnesian War ended. So 404 is very important because the Athenian Empire came to an end. Now, Athens did survive. Athens was not destroyed. I mean, obviously, Athens is the current capital of Greece. Had to tear down its walls, cease its democracy. It basically came under the control of Sparta for a little while. But it wasn't razed to the ground like a lot of cities would have been in their position. Because Sparta knew that it would have been really bad. It would have looked really bad for them to burn down like one of the major cities. Or not even burn it down, but like destroy it to the last brick. So they were just like, okay, well, get rid of your big walls because that's a problem, and you're going to change your government because that seems to be an issue. So let's talk about that, the Golden Age of Athens. So following the Persian Wars and up until the end of the Peloponnesian War, Athens had what's seen as a golden age of culture. This is where most of our views of classical Greece come from because this is where most of the art and architecture happened. This is where all the art, poetry, pottery, trade, most of the stuff that was left behind that we've discovered, or that the Romans discovered and copied, and then we have found through the Romans, came from. So that's why so much of our perception of Greece is so heavily Athenian biased was because of this period of Athens being so wealthy and so artistically and culturally inclined that they just were flooding everything with their stuff. Everything was politically charged, lots of propaganda saying, Athenian democracy was the greatest form of government, even as they were being really imperialistic and running everything over. Boy, that sounds familiar. I love talking about the Cold War. This is when the Parthenon was rebuilt after the Persians had burned it down. So you've got the Temple of Athena is back. This was also when sculpture really took a unique turn. Sculpture followed a mathematical form of perfection rather than trying to imitate life. It was very, I wouldn't say robotic, but like the proportions were literally impossible for human biology. You would have later Roman and Renaissance art that would follow these same patterns. Obviously, being so long ago, a lot of these original statues were lost over time, but due to the Roman obsession with this era of art, they made copies of these statues. So the Roman copies of the Athenian statues still exist today. So that's why we even know what they look like. The discus thrower is one of the more famous. It's in the book, and I think I've got a picture of it. There's others as well. I'll show you guys here in just a minute. They turned theater, which has been popular for hundreds of years, into a show that exemplified the money elite. They looked inward at the greatness of Athens. Again, Athens was Athens was so far up its own ass it could see out its mouth. I mean, like it could do no wrong. Everything Athens did was the greatest thing. Um, which is why, like, when it fell in 404, it was such a big deal. Again, in the book, page 65, there's this little unmaking of Imperial Athens thing, um, which we'll get more into in the next chapter. So this is like modern day Athens. They've still got a lot of the ruins that remain, and then the city built up behind it. This is a painting of what it likely looked like back when everything was still in one piece. So you've got the big statue of Athena back behind the Pantheon. Yeah, the Athena statue is real cool. Oh, I don't have. Oh, I did the art later when we get into the art at the end of the Alexander's period, if I remember right. Hellenistic. Yeah, that was it. Okay. And that's pretty much it for chapter 2. The polis were always very fiercely independent, which always led to a constant struggle, which was to some degrees warfare. The Persian invasion forced them to work together to some extent. But the main part of that wasn't that now we're all working together, but that it shifted the balance of power to actually divide them more. Athens, to protect the polis, became an empire itself and began oppressing the polis, which was eventually put down by Sparta, that as we get into this next chapter, started to inherit a lot of these problems going forward. Now, while we do have plenty of time to get into the next chapter, I feel like garbage, and I have the authority to say, y'all can go home. We'll start chapter 3 on Monday. So, yeah, we'll just do that. That was chapter 2. I'll put that up on Blackboard here in just a minute. And we'll start chapter 3 on Monday. So, that's that.